Please never take health advice from the laughingstock of the world, the great big orange buffoon who's over in the White House. He has zero credentials and his motivation is to restrict women's choices and rights overall. We've seen women's rights completely stripped in America, particularly relating to childbirth and pregnancy over the last few years. And you've got to question why they are only sharing about paracetamol and the very minor link made to autism. And when I say link, there are no cause and effect studies on paracetamol and outcomes of autism. And if we look at correlational effects, then what we also need to be looking at is things like air pollution and getting rid of diesel and gas cars because air pollution is linked to autism. We need to be thinking about completely banning smoking entirely because smoking is also correlated with an increased chance of autism in both the mum and also the father. Cannabis use as well, particularly paternal cannabis use, is also linked correlationally to an increased chance of autism, but you don't hear them talking about that either. It's also really important to recognise and acknowledge that who are diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorders have a genetic component that is inherited from one or both parents, meaning that anything that was environmental had no impact because it's a genetic aspect. Before I continue, I just want to give a massive shout out to all the parents who've got children with autism and any sort of neurodivergent aspect, because this week probably takes another hit emotionally and I am just so sorry that it's the headlines again. What you all need is far more support and not blame games. So let's look at one of the biggest studies. Remember, all the studies that we have are correlational and not cause and effect. We cannot do a randomized control trial, and you certainly can't do a randomized control trial on mice and see whether or not the mice have neurodivergent long term. And in this massive study of over 248,000 children born between 1995 and 2019, so looking at the population all the way up until they're 26 years old here, so really good population-based cohort study. Over 185,909 children had mums who had taken paracetamol in pregnancy. And what the researchers did is not only look at the first child, but also any siblings as well of that family. Now, given the genetic link, this provides a lot more foundation for this particular study. Now, the researchers initially found a small increased chance of autism in children when mums and people had taken paracetamol during pregnancy. But when they compared it to other siblings in the same family and whether they were exposed or not exposed to paracetamol, there was absolutely no difference whatsoever in the development of autism in this particular massive long-term study. And again, highlighting that there's a huge genetic component here. We know from a lot of research, a lot of studies, that parents often find that they suddenly feel like their world makes sense when their child is diagnosed with something, because suddenly they go, do you know what, that was my experience growing up and wow, this makes the world make sense for me now. And maybe this is me having autism, neurodivergent conditions of varying degrees. And often those parents will go and get a diagnosis themselves because suddenly they can see their childhood themselves, their traits in their children, and it suddenly makes sense for them. So this is the study that Donald Trump is going on about. There are so many flaws with this publication, and this is in no way, shape or form like a Cochrane systematic review where they really confound and really look at the results in detail. But let's look at their results. Our analysis demonstrated evidence consistent with an association, so not cause and effect, between exposure to paracetamol during pregnancy and having a child with a neurodevelopment disorder, including ASD and ADHD, though observational limitations preclude the definitive causation. Now, if you scroll down a little bit further, while this association warrants caution, untreated maternal fever and pain poses risks such as neurotube defects, preterm birth. Preterm birth is also linked to developing ASD, and it necessitates a balanced approach. And as with any medication that's prescribed during pregnancy, it's weighing up the benefits and risks of that and what it is treating. Now, even more importantly, the data availability. There were no data sets generated or analysed during the current study. So quite honestly, we have to take this one with a pinch of salt. And as I said in the beginning, there is a political motivation behind this. There are so many things that are linked to ASD, including your own grandmother smoking. And that's because of epigenetics and also thinking that what we do in pregnancy, particularly for girls, actually has an impact on the fetal DNA in the eggs for their grandchildren. And that's because the eggs you'll ever make is in that girl, which is growing inside of that mother. And there are so many other things that are linked to ASD. And at no point do you see them banning diesel or gasoline cars or coal fire mines. Again, air pollution is linked to this. You don't see them banning completely the tobacco industry or smoking, or in particular, policing men's health. Because again, men smoking, men using cannabis or drugs or medications also has an impact on spermatogenesis, which has an impact on a developing fetus. And this is why the MHRA confirms that taking paracetamol during pregnancy remains safe and there is no evidence it causes autism in children. There are very few safe medications for women to take during pregnancy. And paracetamol is used to treat more than just pain. It's also treating fever as well and bringing down that temperature in that mum. Sepsis is still a big factor for women and in terms of the outcomes and in triggering preterm birth. Preterm birth in itself can increase the chance of developing neurodivergent disorders and ASD in the future. Stress and high cortisol is also a trigger of preterm birth, and stress and cortisol levels are higher when women are in pain or when they're poorly or unwell. That in itself can lead to an increased chance of autism and other neurodivergent conditions. Now, I do need to acknowledge that there are some studies that show that long-term continued high dosing and high use of paracetamol during pregnancy. Again, correlational, not cause and effect. And you have to ask yourself, why are these women taking paracetamol for long periods of time and the maximum dose for it? And is there other medical conditions that mean that they need to take that? Are there other aspects of life where they are taking it, for example? And it's taking that step back and asking the question, why? Why is this the case? Because it might not just be the paracetamol. Not very many women take paracetamol to the maximum dose throughout the whole of their pregnancy unless they've got an underlying medical condition that requires it, or they've got an underlying condition that causes severe pain. Most women only take it as and when they need to or require it for things like treating fever, for example, for things like having a cold, having flu, for example, or alternatively being in pain because of things like pelvic girdle pain. And so is it the reason that they are taking the paracetamol that has caused that in the first place as opposed to the paracetamol itself? As with any medication in pregnancy, if you don't need to take it, don't take it. But if you need it, do not feel that guilt, do not feel that shame, and never take your advice from some big orange buffoon in a White House with no credentials in healthcare whatsoever. I guess the only positive is that at least he's not blaming vaccines right now. But my concern is that he wants to use this for his own political motivation to further restrict women's healthcare and reproductive choices. And in, sadly, pregnancy, there is already a limited amount of medications that women can have, especially for treating pain. And it just makes me really anxious and pretty angry that it's, again, another reduction in women's reproductive health. And will there be legislation over in America in particular where they will remove it, they will take it away, and where women will suffer? And so will their babies, particularly if suddenly they can't have paracetamol to treat a fever that then they go into preterm birth and labour.